The keys felt cold in my hand. A shiver ran down my spine. It was a good shiver. This was it. My new apartment, my new start. A small smile crept across my face. I was finally living the American dream. The apartment was everything I had ever wanted. It was small, cozy, and filled with light. The smell of fresh paint lingered in the air. This was my sanctuary, a place to escape the hustle of the city, a place to call my own. Boxes piled up in the corner. They held pieces of my past, memories I was ready to unpack and build upon. It felt like a lifetime ago that I was stuck in a dead-end job, sharing a cramped apartment with 2 other girls. Now I had finally landed my dream job. A job that allowed me to rent this apartment, a job that promised a future. As I stood there, I couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. I had done it. Anne and Joe barged in, their laughter echoing through the empty apartment. They were my rocks, my chosen family here in this concrete jungle. "Becky, you did it!" Anne squealed, engulfing me in a hug. "Your own place! This calls for champagne!" Joe, ever the pragmatic one, was already surveying the boxes. "Where do you want this behemoth of a couch?" he asked, pointing at the monstrosity I'd impulsively bought at a flea market. We spent the evening unpacking, laughing, and sharing stories. Their presence chased away the lingering loneliness that came with moving into a new place. The champagne flowed, and soon, the apartment felt less like an empty shell and more like a home. As the night wore on and the shadows grew longer, I felt a pang of sadness. Anne and Joe lived across town. I wouldn't see them as often. Still, I was grateful. They were my touchstones in this new chapter of my life. The first week in the apartment was blissful. I reveled in the quiet mornings, the sunlight streaming through my window. The city noises felt distant, muffled by the comforting walls of my little haven. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, I noticed him. A man, standing in the hallway. He was tall, gaunt, dressed in an old-fashioned suit. His face was obscured by the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest. I froze, unsure of what to do. He stood there for a moment, unmoving. Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. I told myself it was my imagination, a trick of the light, the stress of the move playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, a seed of unease had been planted. The strange occurrences continued. Objects would move on their own. A book falling from a shelf with a loud thud, my keys disappearing, only to reappear in the most unlikely places. At night, I would lie awake, listening to the creaking of the old building. Whispers seemed to emanate from the walls, faint murmurs that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to rationalize it all. Drafty windows, old plumbing, a hyperactive imagination fueled by too much caffeine and the stress of my new job. But the fear was a constant companion. It lurked in the shadows, whispering doubts in my ear. One night, the whispers turned into screams. I was jolted awake by a bone-chilling shriek coming from the apartment above mine. Then, silence. A silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. The next morning, I learned that Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who lived upstairs, had passed away. They said it was a heart attack. But the terror in her scream, the way it had ripped through the night, told me a different story. Fear wrapped its icy fingers around me. The man in the shadows, the whispers, the moving objects, they all pointed to something sinister. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The line between dreams and reality blurred. I was plagued by nightmares, vivid and terrifying. The man in the suit was a recurring figure, his face always hidden, his presence suffocating. One night, I woke up to find him standing at the foot of my bed. I could feel the coldness emanating from him, the emptiness in his eyes. He reached out to me, his hand a skeletal claw. I screamed, a primal sound born of pure terror, and he vanished. But the fear remained, clinging to me like a shroud. I knew then that I wasn't imagining things. My apartment was haunted. Desperate, I turned to the building superintendent, Mr. Diaz. He listened patiently as I poured out my story, my voice trembling with fear. "There are things," I whispered. "Things I can't explain." Mr. Diaz, a kind man with eyes that held the wisdom of 1,000 lifetimes, simply nodded. "This building," he said, his voice barely a murmur, "it holds many memories, some good, some not so good." He didn't offer any solutions, no promises of exorcisms or ghost hunters. He simply listened, and in his silence I found a strange comfort. I wasn't alone in this. Sleep became a luxury I could barely afford. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind against my window sent my heart racing. The city that never sleeps had become my tormentor, its constant hum a reminder of my solitude. My work suffered. I was withdrawn, jumpy, my mind constantly replaying the terrifying encounters. My boss, a woman with little patience for anything but efficiency, noticed my decline. "Becky," she said, her tone laced with concern, "you're not yourself lately. Is everything all right?" I wanted to tell her everything, to confess that my life had become a waking nightmare. But how could I explain the unexplainable? The exhaustion was taking its toll. Dark circles under my eyes, a constant tremor in my hands. Looking in the mirror one morning, I barely recognized the haunted reflection staring back at me. It was then that I realized something. The fear, the terror, it had dulled. In its place, a strange sense of understanding. These apparitions, these echoes of the past, they weren't there to harm me. They were reaching out, seeking solace. A wave of empathy washed over me. I saw the man in the suit not as a monster but as a lost soul, trapped between worlds. I saw Mrs. Henderson scream not as a threat but as a cry for help. I started researching the history of my building, poring over old newspapers, city records, anything I could find. The whispers in the walls were becoming clearer, like voices yearning to be heard. I learned that my apartment had once been home to a young couple torn apart by tragedy. The man, a struggling artist, had lost his mind after his wife's untimely death. He had taken his own life within these very walls. The whispers, the shadows, they were their story, their pain, their love, their despair. They weren't haunting me, they were seeking solace, a way to move on. The realization hit me like a thunderbolt. I wasn't crazy, I wasn't imagining things. I had been chosen to see them, to hear them, to help them find peace. It was a gift, I realized, but also a burden, a responsibility that weighed heavily on my soul. But I couldn't turn my back on them. They needed me. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and listened. The whispers were no longer terrifying. They were filled with sorrow, with longing, with a desperate need for release. My fear was replaced by a quiet determination. I would help them. I would be their voice, their bridge to the other side. I didn't know how, but I knew I had to try. The journey ahead would be long, arduous, and undoubtedly terrifying, but I was no longer afraid. I was ready to face the unknown, to embrace the shadows, and to help the lost souls find their way home. This was my purpose. This was my new beginning.